Hello, I'm Susan Thomas, the training coordinator of the institute that Dr. Wolfensberger founded at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York, when he came there in September 1973. I started out of college as a secretary and eventually became one of several training coordinators at the institute, and then the only one, which is what I have been for almost all my years at the Training Institute, and that's still the role that I claim and fill. Since Dr. Wolfensberger's death in 2011, I've been trying to keep the Institute going to continue his teachings. I was asked to present a brief biographical sketch of Dr. Wolfensberger with two purposes in mind. One is to provide a bit of background for better understanding him, as many people might simply be curious about someone who was influential to them and to the field, but about whom they just do not know very much. The other purpose was to help us understand how his mind, his soul, and his heart might have been prepared to notice and take in, and eventually to act upon the ideas that he ended up studying and teaching. Dr. Wolfensberger left behind a very substantial archive, almost 1,300 linear feet of materials, which are deposited at the University of Nebraska Medical Center's Health Sciences Library. And in that archive are almost 18 inches worth just of many folders that he made containing materials and mementos relevant to the different times in his life. So there's a folder and material on his childhood in Germany before World War II. There's another one on the war and the period immediately after. There's another folder with materials on his immigration and early settling into the U.S., another on his times at undergraduate college and at graduate school, and his doctoral studies, and his early employment in institutions, and his postdoctoral year in England, and then the various places that he lived and worked after that. So, this very brief sketch that I will present in no way does justice to the material he left behind. As I said, it's only meant to give us a bit more understanding of him. The chapter on this subject in the Festschrift book is longer than what I will present here, and some of what I will tell you will be taken up again in separate Festschrift presentations. You should also know that I'm reporting on what we might call, for lack of a better term, the external events of his life, what played out to be seen in the world, and things that I knew of or learned about. I'm not reporting on his inner life here. His daughters Margaret and Joan reviewed earlier drafts of the chapter, and they added some of their memories and corrections where I was in error. Now, you may know the musical play and film The Sound of Music. And one of the songs in it says, "Let's start at the very beginning, a very good place to start." Well, things in life are deeply interconnected, so the very beginning is probably very long ago and far away, and we cannot know it. But I will start with the beginning of his life. Dr. Wolfensberger's full name is Wolf Peregrine, like the falcon, Joachim Wolfensberger, but not with the E at the end, like the falcon. I will refer to him here either as Wolf or Dr. Wolfensberger. He was born in Mannheim, Germany, which is a few miles west of Heidelberg, on the 26th of July, 1934, a year and a half after Hitler had come to power. He was the third child and second son of Friedrich and Helena Wolfensberger. And here is Wolf at about 3 or 4 years old. His sister Mariana was the eldest, older than Wolf by almost 9 years, and his brother Hanno was the middle child, 5.5 years older than Wolf. Wolf's daughters said that his mother Helena was thought of as the intellectual of the family. She was the only girl in her high school class to achieve the Abitur certificate for passing the most difficult and advanced courses. She was one of 5 sisters, giving Wolf 4 maternal aunts, 2 of whom eventually also emigrated to the U.S., and he continued to see them throughout his adult life. His mother's family was from Switzerland, an ancient family of miners and engineers. His mother's maiden name was Löwit, and her father Ottokar, Wolf's maternal grandfather, was also an engineer, originally from Bohemia. He had designed and was the director of the electric rail system in the city of Mannheim. In fact, the reason the Löwits had come to Germany from their Swiss home was that in 1900, Ottokar was recruited by the Burgermeister of Mannheim to lay out its electric train system, as he had already done for the city of Basel in Switzerland. Ottokar met Wolf's maternal grandmother Johanna Hitz when he was working for her father Conrad, who was the chief engineer of the Schinnige Platte Railway near Interlaken in the mountains of Switzerland. Now, this maternal grandfather, Ottokar Löwit, was Jewish, which made Wolf's mother and her sisters half Jews, and Wolf and his brother and sister a quarter Jewish. These were relevant identities in the years of World War II that were soon to come. Wolf's father's name was Friedrich, and his family was from the south of Germany, but they were also originally from Switzerland, from the Wolfensberger mountain. And like Wolf's mother's family, they too had ancient roots there. The Wolfensbergers were an old, noble, knightly line that can be traced back to the 1230s. His father's family held a large farm in southern Germany on the Swiss border. His father had 3 brothers and a sister, but apart from time that Wolf spent with them on the family farm during the war, he apparently did not have much contact with them. Wolf's father had a PhD degree from the University of Tübingen. He was employed as a banker, but sometime after the Nazis came to power, he lost his job, reportedly because the Nazis demanded he divorce his wife, who was, you remember, half Jewish, and they also demanded that he fire his secretary, who was Jewish, and he refused to do these things. It's not certain why he was never arrested for this and other offenses against the regime, but he had been a soldier in the First World War. He was injured in a way that permanently incapacitated his left hand. And being a veteran of that war was a valued role in Germany, even to the Nazis. Once he lost his banking position, he had some odd jobs, including selling magazines, and he did some teaching on the side, and he also spent much of his time doing family research, which Wolf also took up in the later decades of his own life. In fact, in 2004, Wolf returned to Switzerland along with his wife Nancy, one of his aunts, and his daughter Margaret and one of his granddaughters for a big reunion of his mother's side of the family, the Hitzes. In Mannheim, the Wolfensberger family lived around the corner from his Löwit grandparents in a 4th-floor apartment. During the war, his mother's father, Ottokar, would stay with them on occasion. He was by this time quite old and unwell, so when there was an air raid and the family would flee to the bunker shelters down below, he, the grandfather, would sometimes have to be left behind in the family's flat because Wolf's mother couldn't get him down 4 flights of stairs quickly enough. And once, when he was able to descend to the shelter in time, he was turned away because he was a Jew. Eventually, bombs destroyed the upper stories of the building, so the family moved into a 1st-floor apartment. Sometimes during the war, Wolf would be sent to dig around in the debris for useful materials. And once he found a piece of metal that he fashioned into a skeleton key, and he claimed that it would open any door in the city of Mannheim. He kept this key his whole life. He also told of riding his bicycle home in the dark in the rubble-strewn streets of the city, and with no lights it was very dangerous. He said you never knew who or what you might run into. Mannheim was an industrial city on the Rhine, and so it was the target of bombings. And so, as happened to so many other children on both sides during the war, Wolf got sent at only 9 years old, far from his home in the city, to the relative safety of the countryside. This was from August 1943 to September 1945, and he went to 2 different places. First, he and his sister and brother were all sent to Alsace-Lorraine, on the border of France and Germany, but then under German control. There, he lived with a farm family, and his brother and sister were taken in by other families in the same area. He said that this family, the Müllers, were very good to him in many ways, including seeing to it that he learned his catechism so that he could make his first communion. But he lost touch with them after he went back home, as letters would disappear in the chaos of the war and its aftermath. Almost 20 years later, though, he was able to reunite with them when he and his wife Nancy were traveling through Europe in 1963. The family were very happy and surprised to see him. They had not known that he had survived the war. He met with them for the last time in June 1994. I said that his sister and brother lived with other families nearby, but at some point all 3 of them got together again and trekked back home to Mannheim, which is a trip of over 100 kilometers, over 60 miles, through war-torn and often dangerous country. The second time Wolf was sent away for safety was to distant family on his father's side in southern Germany. You remember I told you about that, about 100 miles south of Mannheim. He stayed with them for a while and remembered them as also being kind to him. But then he went to live with another unrelated family on another farm, and he remembered some of these people as having been mean to him. At some point during this second stay, Wolf's father picked him up and brought him to a nearby monastery of nuns who were running a hospital for the war wounded, and where his father was then working as a gatekeeper. Now, these two sojourns, during which he was separated from his entire family for long periods of time at a young age, had a very deep and lasting impact on him. He used to tell how painfully lonely it was to be sent out on one of the farms to herd the pigs. They apparently lived up to their nature and were very piggish and uncooperative. And he said he hated that work. But he also believed that it taught him great endurance, and also, very importantly, it taught him to be alone. He was also deeply marked by a number of narrow and terrifying escapes he had, again like so many other children and adults during the war. For instance, I said Mannheim was the target of bombing raids, over 150 of them during the war, so there were many occasions for running to a bunker for shelter. And towards the end of the war, as the German army was retreating before the Allies, Wolf was making his way back home from the countryside when he was almost run over by tanks rumbling by. He also recalled that planes from both sides, as they made their way back to their home bases, they would try to lighten their loads and save fuel by emptying their ammunition over the fields below. That was obviously very dangerous and destructive to any people in the fields who were often just ordinary farmers, civilians. But at the same time, he remembered the kindness of ordinary people who would see him, a young boy, but a stranger to them, walking through their area and presumably heading away from some war disaster or heading towards home, they didn't know, but they would call out, Junge, it means boy in German, and just give him food to take along on his way. Should we stop? No, keep going. Also, even before the war, when he was only a little more than 4 years old, he remembered the 9th of November 1938, when the Nazis attacked and destroyed synagogues, Jewish businesses, homes, hospitals, and schools, and arrested tens of thousands of Jews throughout Germany. It was called Kristallnacht, which is German for Night of Broken Glass. Wolf said he remembered his father the next day talking over with a Jewish neighbor what had happened in the night and what was likely to happen next. It was an early childhood memory, perhaps one of the earliest. He was just 4 years old, and he told us that each year, for the rest of his life, he marked that day. During the war, his mother had to take boarders in to make ends meet, and Wolf also remembered her taking in 1 or 2 Jewish refugees, but I do not know if this was for more than one night or on how many occasions. Now, even though his mother was, you remember, what the Nazis called a half-Jew, she was not arrested and deported, though Wolf said that would eventually have come after all the full Jews were taken care of. And he said he was thrown out of his kindergarten in 1939 or 40 because he was a quarter Jew. Now, the reason his full Jewish grandfather, Ottokar Löwit, was not taken was probably due to his own valued role. As I said, he had laid out the whole tram system for the city and was its director and a respected local figure. However, as I also said, this grandfather was once barred from entering an air raid shelter because he was Jewish. He simply returned home and waited out the bombing raid there. And there is now a street in Mannheim, Löwitstrasse, which is said to be dedicated to Ottokar Löwit. Wolf's father was apparently rather outspoken, even to the Nazis. On one occasion, Wolf was with his father out on the street listening to someone spouting propaganda about how well the war was going for Germany. Wolf said his father contested it, said it was all lies, and a local policeman hustled him away. Wolf was petrified and trailed after his father. He said he was crying and wondering what they were going to do to him, and he saw the policeman warn him, where he was away from the other people who had been gathered to hear the news, warn him that he had better not talk like that or the policeman would be forced to arrest him, and then he let Wolf's father go. And I said earlier that Wolf's father had been called in by the local Gestapo and commanded to divorce his half-Jewish wife, which, as I also said, he would not do. Wolf also remembered that his father regularly listened to the news broadcasts from England at night on a radio he had built himself, because that was the only way to learn what was really happening at the front. That's how he knew the man on the street corner was spouting lies, because he had heard the real broadcast from England. Well, at the time the news came on, he said his father would turn off all the lights in the room where the radio was so that no one looking in from outside could think there was anyone in the room, and they would get down on the floor and crawl to the radio set and then listen with earphones so that no one else could hear. Well, 40 years after the war had ended, in September 1985, Wolf held a little celebration. First, a mass, remember he was Catholic, followed by a party, and this celebration was in gratitude for having survived the war. He said he was a little ashamed it had taken him so long to give proper thanks. Another celebrant there was a woman living in Syracuse at the time who, like Wolf, had also been a small child during the war in Germany, and they both told stories of their close calls. She lived through the 1945 firebombing of the city of Pforzheim, which was a center of jewelry and watchmaking. That bombing killed nearly a third of the city's population. Even the very river was on fire. So, that was a brief sketch of Wolf's early childhood. Well, after the war, Germany was devastated, and the population had to subsist largely on bulk food sent over by the American government. And Wolf said that that led him to despise, among other things, cake frosting made with Crisco, because that was one of the things the Americans shipped over. He said he received much education from his older brother and sister and from his father, who had time to spend with him because he was unemployed. Both during and after the war, Wolf's schooling was sporadic. The teachers were in the military or had been arrested or were otherwise simply not there. He returned to school in 1946 at age 12 as the youngest in a class where some students were as old as 16, and where there were few books. He said, in fact, there were not even enough pencils and desks. In 1950, at age 16, he emigrated to the United States with his mother. Here's what he looked like then. They came over on a ship and settled in Memphis, Tennessee, where his sister Mariana and her husband were already living. His sister's husband had survived being held in not just one, but several concentration camps. That's another remarkable story. For Wolf, emigration meant leaving behind in Germany his brother Hanno and his sick father, whom he was never to see again. His father died in Germany on New Year's Day of 1959. As I said, Wolf was Catholic, and he practiced his faith his whole life long. He brought with him to the U.S. a copy of the Christian classic The Imitation of Christ, in German, of course, that his parish priest in Germany had given him. It had a red leather cover. And I'm sure he treasured it also because such things could not have been easy to come by during the years of scarcity following the war, and therefore giving it to Wolf must have been a sacrifice for the priest. When Wolf and his mother arrived in the States, they first stayed in New York City with one of her sisters, one of Wolf's aunts, and her son, his cousin. Wolf said the cousin taught him about a bit about being an American boy. Wolf later spoke, and probably with a good deal of understatement, of the next years as being ones of difficult acclimatization to a new country. His mother became a practical nurse, and Wolf himself worked first in a welding shop and then for 4 years as a lab technician for a chemical company. Among other jobs, he tested the contents of railroad cars that carried dangerous toxic substances. He had a small motorcycle that he rode back and forth to work and school. There was a neighbor family, the Spiras, who were very good and welcoming to him. He said Paul Spira also helped him learn to be an American, and he kept in contact with the Spiras and their children for the rest of his life. Wolf worked his way through a small Catholic college, Siena College, that has since closed down, spending all day at his job and then going to school at night afterwards. He majored in philosophy. Well, all these stresses of a new country, a new language, working full-time and also going to school pretty much full-time made him very sick at least once. One nun who taught at this school was very good to him, and he kept in lifelong contact with her as well, visiting her decades later when she was quite elderly. You remember that Wolf's middle name was Peregrine. You know it as a falcon, but it means pilgrim or wanderer. And this nun suggested, no doubt with good intentions, that he go by the Americanized version of that name, Perry, which wouldn't sound so German so soon after the war. He did use that name for a short time in college. When he graduated from college, he went on scholarship to St. Louis University, a Jesuit school in Missouri, to get his master's degree in psychology. And this is what he looked like then. And then he returned to Tennessee, to Peabody College in Nashville, for his doctorate in psychology and mental retardation research. The former Peabody College is now part of Vanderbilt University. Two of his fellow students at Peabody, James Mann from Mississippi and Rolando Santos from the Philippines, along with their wives, were to remain lifelong friends of his and Nancy's. I've mentioned his wife Nancy several times now, so next I'll explain how they met. As part of his master's and doctoral studies, Wolf had his first experiences working in several different institutions: a mental hospital, as they were then called, and two mental retardation state schools, as they were then called. One of these state schools was in southern Indiana, and Nancy's mother worked there. She also ran a farm with her husband, so Nancy was a farmer's daughter. The two of them met when she was looking to buy a typewriter and Wolf was looking to sell his. The farm in Indiana is still in the family, and Wolf and Nancy and their children spent many holidays and other long stretches of time there over the years. Wolf and Nancy were married in February 1960, and their three children, Margaret, Joan, and Paul, were born over the next 6 years. Like many young couples, they moved frequently in the early years of their marriage, within Tennessee for Wolf's schooling and work, and to northern New Jersey for a one-year internship at the E.R. Johnstone Training and Research Center in Bordentown. On a last visit there in 2010, Wolf and Nancy discovered that what was once the research center is now a women's prison, a fate that befell so many former mental institutions. Well, their daughter Margaret was a toddler and Joan just an infant when the family went to England for now Dr. Wolfensberger's postdoctoral study year in 1962 and 63. Here he is then. This postdoc was at the Maudsley Psychiatric Hospital in London. During this year, he also did much touring and visiting of services in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and throughout the continent. To do some of this traveling, he bought a used Volkswagen, which he and Nancy drove up the mountains in Switzerland. She told us how it was a terrifying trip, and then they brought it back with them to America. These visits and observations had a very big impact on him, and when they returned to the U.S., he tried to spread the word about the good things that he had seen there and get people in the States to imitate them. This was also his first trip back to Germany since emigrating over a decade earlier. He visited several German settings for the handicapped, and as he later reported, his guides were distressed when he asked them to show him more wards for adults. They were distressed because there simply were no more, so many handicapped people having been killed during the war. On their return to the U.S., Wolf worked for a year in one more institution, a brand new training school in Northville, Michigan, and here's a picture of him then, before they moved to Omaha, Nebraska in 1964, where he started work at the Nebraska Psychiatric Institute of the University of Nebraska Medical School. And the rest, as they say, is history. Several more times in the late 1960s, Dr. Wolfensberger returned to Europe and continued to visit interesting services there. His mother went back to Mannheim in the mid-1960s to stay, and he made numerous trips to visit her, as well as numerous teaching trips, mostly to the United Kingdom, but also to Italy during the 1980s and 90s. His mother died at the good old age of 94 in July 1990, and he returned a few more times to Germany for work in the early 2000s. It was in Omaha, where Robert Kugel was his boss at the Nebraska Psychiatric Institute, that Dr. Wolfensberger co-edited the 1969 book, Changing Patterns in Residential Services for the Mentally Retarded, the Blue Book as it was called on account of its deep blue cover. This was the book that, in Wolf's judgment, broke the back of the institutional service system, and in it was the first written explanation in any language of the principle of normalization. At the first conference on normalization and social role valorization in May 1994, he told the story of getting that book written and published as a gripping cliffhanger of near-miss deadlines and of having to corral, almost kidnap, lots of less than forthcoming writers, including the eminent Dr. Gunnar Dybwad and Bengt Nierje, one of the fathers of normalization who wrote that normalization chapter. Here's Dr. Wolfensberger telling that story at that conference. The conference presentation was later published in the Book of Proceedings, edited by Bob Flynn and Ray LeMay, who you see seated at the table. While living in Omaha, Dr. Wolfensberger also taught 4 summers at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, a job that was mediated by his friend Dr. Jimmy Mann from Peabody days. Here he is in Mississippi about that time. And Wolf was very instrumental in establishing in Omaha the first Montessori school there, called the Wisdom School, which the Wolfensberger children attended and where Nancy helped out. Both Wolf and Nancy had fond memories of their years in Omaha and were very sorry to leave. Those days sound like they were full of very energized, even frenzied activity as Wolf traveled the state with a pack of other professionals and parents of handicapped people who were working intensively to organize and establish services other than institutions. The only state institution for retarded people in Nebraska, in Beatrice, was one of the big and bad old ones. Wolf's schedule was packed, and the Wolfensberger home was the site, and Nancy was the hostess, of many meetings and suppers and parties in connection with this work, and with Wolf's developing many students into leadership in the new service reform movement. In late April 1969, he made a 2-week tour through Scandinavia to see their services based on normalization. He wrote and taught about these on his return to the U.S., just as he had done about what he had seen in the United Kingdom and Europe in 1962 and 63. And he also drew upon what he had learned there in establishing the first normalization-based comprehensive system of community services for mentally retarded people anywhere in North America, namely what was called the Eastern Nebraska Community Office of Retardation, centered in Douglas County, the county that contains Omaha. The abbreviation for that entity was NCORE. He later said that normalization pooled together, so to speak, many of the separate ideas and improvements that he and the other concerned professionals and parents were pushing for in the new community service system. Especially once NCORE got going in 1970, lots of visitors came to see these services, and that meant lots more hosting for Nancy, as well as much travel for Wolf outside of Nebraska, spreading the word about normalization. Here he is touring through one of the first group homes there. There he is on the left. It was also in Nebraska, and in connection with the establishment of NCORE, that he got the first citizen advocacy program going in Lincoln, the state capital. And to this day, there are still citizen advocacy programs in Nebraska. From Omaha, the family moved to Toronto in 1971 for 2 years, where G. Allen Rower had invited Dr. Wolfensberger to work as a visiting scholar at the National Institute on Mental Retardation. Rower was the director of that institute. Again, the acronym for that entity was NIMR, from its initials, and it was a training arm of what was then called the Canadian Association for the Mentally Retarded, the voluntary association of parents and family members and other interested advocates for mentally handicapped people. During these 2 years in Canada, Wolf traveled across the country teaching normalization and service planning and helping to establish demonstration projects. And he also continued to travel and speak elsewhere, including in many places in the U.S. and occasionally in Europe, as at international conferences. He also did a lot of writing and publishing while in Canada, including the books on citizen advocacy and PASS in 1973, and the book that we can call his blockbuster, The Principle of Normalization in Human Services, in 1972. This book eventually sold over 100,000 copies, becoming a nonfiction bestseller, which is very impressive for a nonfiction book in a rather specialized topic area. NIMR published 19 of the many books and monographs he authored or co-authored over the course of his career. The children helped too, making copies and overhead transparencies in their father's office, work that they continued for a while in Syracuse as well. It was also in Canada that he first encountered L'Arche, the religiously based international movement founded by Jean Vanier, in which non-handicapped people voluntarily share their lives with mentally handicapped ones, and which centers the spiritual life and identity of the handicapped. Wolf left Canada in the fall of 1973, but continued visiting and frequently teaching there for many years thereafter. September 1973 brought him to Syracuse University and its Division of Special Education and Rehabilitation. He came at the invitation of Dr. Burton Blatt, who had actually been trying to get Wolf for several years by then. Blatt was at that time the director of the Division of Special Education and Rehabilitation and eventually became dean of the School of Education, and Wolf remained close to him until Blatt's death in January 1985. Wolf came as a full professor and taught 2 graduate-level courses each semester, from fall 1973 through the early 1980s. This was the last move for the family into an arts and crafts style home designed by the noted architect Ward Wellington Ward. It had numerous built-in bookcases, a perfect house for a scholar, and they also filled it with the antiques that Wolf and Nancy collected. He taught academic courses on normalization, residential services, human service planning, social advocacies, universals of human service, dynamics of families of the handicapped, an advanced seminar on mental retardation with heavy emphasis on history, and eventually courses composed of short workshops, usually 2 and 3 days each, that students could take for academic credit. And these were on such topics as threats to the sanctity of life of devalued people and human service technologies. On arriving at Syracuse, Dr. Wolfensberger also founded the Training Institute for Human Service Planning, Leadership, and Change Agentry, for obvious reasons referred to by its shorter name, the Training Institute, or even the TI. He continued to direct the institute for the rest of his life, even after he was no longer teaching university courses. A separate Festschrift presentation and another chapter in the Festschrift book give a detailed story of the Training Institute. The Institute gave short, intensive training courses, anywhere from several hours to a week in length, mostly in North America, but also overseas. And these were given to people working in human services, as well as to family members and advocates, mostly in the field of mental retardation, but also in mental disorder, aging, corrections, and so on. And this was in addition to his academic teaching load. The first TI workshop was held in Syracuse in January 1974, a PASS workshop. To start, there were workshops on normalization and PASS, on human service planning and related change agentry, on normalizing community residential services, on advocacy in general and citizen advocacy specifically, on voluntary associations, and on aging. Eventually, there were also workshops on the history of human services, on model coherency, and both secular and religious retreats for service workers. Then came workshops on social role valorization and passing, on the growing legitimization of death-making of devalued people, on the sad state of the service system and how to function morally within it. And there were workshops on the iconography of mental retardation, on improving the personal appearance of devalued people, on human service technologies, on the post-primary production economy, on violence in human services, on oh so many topics. These were given not only in Syracuse but also elsewhere in the US and still in Canada. For many years, at almost all the workshops held in Syracuse, Nancy was in the back of the room at least part of the time, overseeing the coffee and donuts and often helping at the registration table and managing the book sales. Here is Dr. Wolfensberger teaching one of those workshops in 1991 with his usual setup of 3 screens. Together, the courses and all the workshops were a very heavy amount of work. Dr. Wolfensberger always arrived very early at the office, sometimes in a bit of competition with graduate students and training staff to see who could show up first. Plus, in his early years at Syracuse, he was also attending regular meetings of the Center on Human Policy, as well as getting a local L'Arche community established and then attending its board meetings for many years. And he was consulting, including with people at the local state institution for retarded people called the Syracuse Developmental Center, about normalizing that institution and also getting community residences started. So this meant his evenings and weekends were pretty full as well. He hired Hank Bersani Jr. as the first training coordinator of the TI in 1975. Before that, Hank had been a special education teacher in the Syracuse City Schools, and after his stint at the TI, he went to graduate school. From 1977 through 1979, the TI also ran the Pennsylvania Evaluation Project, headed by Joe Osborne, who came from Indiana to Syracuse to take the position, and which conducted pass evaluations of community residences throughout Pennsylvania. Through both his university courses and workshops, Dr. Wolfensberger mentored many, many young people, at least they were young then. And he set very high expectations for them, as indeed he did for everyone, and this did not always please them when it came time to receive a grade for coursework. Over its many years, the Training Institute had lots and lots of graduate student assistants from both the US and Canada, and numerous training coordinators. Most of these went on to influential positions in human services, such as state-level directorships, and to run well-known consulting projects. In the chapter of this presentation, I give lots of names, but I'm always afraid of having overlooked someone. There were so many. Whenever possible, Dr. Wolfensberger would try to bring students along to his teaching and consulting work, and would often give them opportunities to learn by doing, that is, to present a module for which they would have to study and prepare. Also, even if they were not graduate students, many workshop participants took what they learned from Training Institute workshops and assumed influential positions and roles. There were also, at the TI, lots and lots of work-study students, many secretaries, both part-time and full-time. As I said, that was my first job at the Training Institute, and a number of handicapped workers of high school age or older who helped out around the office for shorter or longer periods. One worked at the TI for over 20 years. At its maximum, besides Dr. Wolfensberger, the TI had 9 full and part-time employees, not counting graduate student assistants, but this situation only lasted for 2 years of that very big staff. At the Training Institute, there was an inbox, not only for each secretary and training coordinator and intern and work-study student and graduate student, but also for what were called TI associates. These were people who attended workshop after workshop and had developed a relationship with Wolf, as well as former employees and students who had gone on to work elsewhere. Into these boxes, Wolf would put copies of articles, news clippings, cartoons, and so forth that he thought would interest them. He also kept a record in the form of 3x5 index cards of people who had attended pass workshops specifically, and eventually passing workshops as well, on which their progress through different training roles, such as report writer, team leader, and so on, would be tracked. And this card file would be consulted to constitute the training team for upcoming pass and passing workshops. During all this time, the Training Institute also hosted many, many visitors from the US and abroad. They might stay anywhere from a half day to a full year in attending training events and absorbing daily lessons from Wolf and the TI. Some who came for short visits were hosted at the Wolfensberger home. To those who stayed for a period of time, Wolf gave the enhancing title Visiting Scholar, which was the same title he had when he worked at NIMR in Toronto. The many visitors and the fact that he sometimes conducted his classes in the family living room also gave many opportunities for the Wolfensberger hospitality to shine. Parties and other gatherings with lavish food and drink, and often some entertainment that Wolf devised, always relevant to one of his teaching topics. It was a point of principle, and possibly also of pride to him, that the Training Institute be independent. And in order to do so, it had to be essentially self-supporting. This meant that the work of generating enough income to support the Training Institute, albeit it was a pretty bare-bones operation, but still staff had to be paid, all this work, most of it anyway, fell on Dr. Wolfensberger's shoulders, which was yet another reason why he worked so hard. It was also one reason why he developed an SOP, standard operating procedure, to cut costs by sorting and using and reusing all sorts of scrap paper, everything from used envelopes to student papers and exam books, and this was long before recycling was a common practice. As another source of income, in 1983 he launched a subscription-based publication called TIPS. It stood for Training Institute Publication Series, which essentially consisted of his reporting and commenting on wide-ranging developments in society at large and in human services that were anyway connected to his teaching and writing. Like virtually all Training Institute projects, TIPS was low-tech. For many years it was typed and run off on stencils, and even when it was eventually done on a word processor, it was still run off on a copy machine. Tips was intended to be issued 6 times per year, about 25 pages per issue, but the never-ending demands on him for teaching, traveling, and writing often meant that a double or triple or even occasionally a quadruple issue had to be put out instead of single issues. A number of factors, including his insistence on speaking truthfully to unpopular topics, led to a long, slow decline in subscribers, so that eventually putting Tips together was more trouble than it was worth, though he very much enjoyed writing it. And the last issue was late 2007. In all his working life, from his earliest days, Dr. Wolfensberger never hesitated to take up controversial issues in both speech and writing, especially if he thought they were urgent and something on which he had a special capacity or talent or even obligation to address. After the early days of promoting normalization and other service reforms, which initially those were very controversial, these controversial topics later came to include threats to the sanctity of life of devalued people, or what he termed their legitimized death-making, as well as the shortcomings of the organized service system, the limitations and the short-livedness and even the errors of some service reforms, and the embrace by Western societies of values and lifestyles that were both morally wrong and inimical to the welfare of vulnerable marginal people. He somehow summoned the courage and clarity to respond to the criticisms he received for such teaching and proclaiming, and often his responses to these criticisms sharpened even more the fundamental issues and decisions at stake. At times in his life, Wolf attended daily Mass, and for many years when he lived in Syracuse, he met regularly 1 or more times a week for prayer with other believers. In the last few decades of his life, he was an integral member of the Unity Kitchen community of the Catholic Worker in Syracuse. The Catholic Worker movement was founded in 1933 in New York City by Dorothy Day and Peter Moran. It's a loose association of lay people in Roman Catholicism that emphasizes voluntary poverty, personal performance of the works of mercy, particularly on the poor and homeless, and nonviolence. So there was a local community in Syracuse of that nature. During all these years, Dr. Wolfensberger was, to say the least, a prolific writer, producing over 50 published books, over 60 chapters, 240-some articles, as well as 28 book reviews and 6 poems, and he had more potential manuscripts in preparation when he died. He received many awards and recognitions in his lifetime, though only a few did he put much store by. Especially towards the end of his life, they were not as important to him as his work, his teaching, and his writing, which we hope will be a more lasting tribute. From his youth, Wolf had loved to hike, especially in the mountains, and was a conservationist. He was also, from early age, a lover of cats. He played chess and achieved the rating of expert. At some point, he learned the harmonica, and there's a family photo of him serenading his grandson with it. You can see it at the end of the film Jerry Smith made about Dr. Wolfensberger. He was a collector of stamps and of all sorts of human service history artifacts, including picture postcards of old service settings that he termed psycho postcards, and books. Oh, the books. Approximately 1,000 books on human service history alone, and a total collection of over 5,000 on varied topics, all of them now at the archives in Nebraska. Early in their marriage, he also refinished furniture, such as some of the antiques he and Nancy collected. Wolf and Nancy's daughter, Margaret, became an attorney and lives outside of Philadelphia. Joan got her doctorate in healthcare and lives in Chicago. There's a family picture of Wolf and Joan together in full academic regalia. It's very impressive. Their son, Paul, continued the family tradition by studying engineering, and he now lives in Tennessee. Wolf and Nancy had 3 grandchildren by Margaret and her husband, Tim Sager. Their names are John Tate, Jennifer Johanna, and Hadley. Wolf's brother Hanno died in May 2007. His last aunt Haiti, in May 2016 at nearly 100 years of age, and his sister Mariana in June 2021 at age 95. Wolf suffered with a form of leukemia for the last 3 decades of his life, though he continued to work all that time. Here he is in the last year of his life wearing one of his jaunty berets. His last presentation was at the invitation of Steve Taylor to speak to a doctoral class at Syracuse University in November 2010, just a few months before his death. Taylor had been a graduate student when Wolf first came to Syracuse and eventually became the director of the Center on Human Policy there, which I said Dr. Wolfensberger worked with the Center on Human Policy when he first came to Syracuse University. Wolfensberger died on the night of 27 February 2011, a Sunday, in Syracuse, New York, and he is buried in the Arts Family Cemetery in southern Indiana. So is his wife Nancy, who died in Syracuse 3 years later on 10 August 2014. Requiescat in pace.